You're standing in a room you haven't seen in daylight for 8,000 days. The walls press close, windowless, breathing the stale air of your own fear. You've heard your brother's deaths announced through these stones. 3 times the footsteps came, 3 times they didn't come for you. But you've learned that survival isn't mercy. It's just slower execution. Every morning you wake expecting the silk cord. Every night you sleep grateful for one more dawn you probably won't see. Then the door opens and they tell you you're Sultan. What strikes me most about exploring these moments isn't just the history. It's that you're here with me right now, reading about someone who lost their mind 4 centuries ago, and somehow that connection across time still matters. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. It's genuinely incredible that we're uncovering this together from different corners of the world. The year is 1640, and the man trembling in the doorway of his prison cell is about to inherit 3 continents. Ibrahim Osmanoglu is 35 years old. He has spent 22 years, more than half his life, locked in the cafes, a specially designed suite of rooms in Topkapi Palace with no windows to the outside world. The Ottoman system was efficient in its brutality. To prevent a civil war, each new sultan typically executed his brothers. Ibrahim watched this happen 3 times. He knew the executioner's footsteps, knew the sound of silk cords tightening around royal throats in adjacent chambers. He knew he was next. Except now he wasn't. Sultan Murad IV lay dead, and Ibrahim was the last surviving male of the Ottoman dynasty. The empire faced an impossible choice: execute their final prince and watch their bloodline end forever, or crown a man who'd spent 2 decades preparing to die. When Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha arrived with the news, Ibrahim didn't believe him. He thought it was the trap he'd been expecting for 22 years. They'd lure him out, then kill him. Ottoman records describe hours of negotiation through the locked door. Finally, they brought Murad's corpse to prove he was truly dead. Only then did Ibrahim emerge, blinking, shaking, free. He was also completely, irrevocably broken. Modern psychologists looking at Ibrahim's symptoms, the dissociative episodes, the paranoid delusions, the inability to distinguish threat from safety, would recognize severe PTSD, probably combined with institutionalization syndrome. But the Ottoman court in 1640 had no framework for trauma. They simply handed absolute power to a man whose mind had fractured under decades of anticipated murder, then watched to see what would happen. What happened was that Ibrahim's mother made a calculation. Kosum Sultan was one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, a former concubine who'd become the power behind 2 thrones. She looked at her damaged son and saw 2 problems. He was psychologically incapable of ruling, and he was the last male heir. Her solution addressed both. She encouraged Ibrahim to focus on the harem. The dynasty needed heirs. Ibrahim needed distraction. It seemed pragmatic. She had just handed a broken man the one arena where his damage could expand without limit. Ibrahim didn't approach the harem like his predecessors. Earlier, sultans maintained harems of 40 to 60 women, large by any standard, but manageable, functioning as both pleasure and practical politics. Ibrahim turned it into something else. Within 6 months of taking the throne, he'd expanded the imperial harem to over 200 women. Within a year, to nearly 300. But the numbers alone don't capture what was happening inside those marble halls. The procurement records tell the real story. Ibrahim sent agents across 3 continents with instructions that grew increasingly specific and increasingly strange. He wanted women who matched exact physical descriptions. Not just beautiful, but women with particular measurements, specific skin tones, precise facial features. He demanded virgins from specific ethnic groups, then women with certain personality types. The imperial treasury ledgers from 1641 to 1644 show expenditures that make no sense unless you understand what Ibrahim was building. Not a harem, but an elaborate system of control disguised as pleasure. thousands of gold pieces spent on perfumes formulated to specific requirements. Fortunes poured into importing foods believed to enhance vitality, not occasionally but constantly, as if Ibrahim were trying to fill a hunger that had nothing to do with appetite. The palace workshops received orders that the court chroniclers recorded with obvious discomfort: silk restraints, jeweled accessories for sexual purposes, mechanical devices whose exact nature they declined to describe. These weren't the purchases of a man seeking pleasure. They were the purchases of a man trying to exercise absolute control over bodies because he'd had no control over his own life. Then came the architectural modifications. Construction records show Ibrahim ordering hidden viewing chambers built into the harem quarters, places where he could watch women without their knowledge, new rooms with specialized acoustics that amplified intimate sounds, sections of the imperial gardens redesigned with secluded areas where Ibrahim could stage what the records delicately call elaborate performances. He was creating a theater where women were props, where he could direct every scene, control every moment, possess every outcome. The women themselves became players in increasingly complex scenarios. Court documents describe themed nights where concubines dressed as mythological figures or historical characters and participated in role-playing sessions that lasted for days. Ibrahim orchestrated everything with meticulous attention to detail: who wore what, who stood where, who said which lines. These weren't parties. They were psychological experiments conducted by a man whose own psyche had been destroyed by powerlessness, now wielding absolute power over others. He developed an intricate system of rewards and punishments based on sexual performance. Women who pleased him received jewels, better quarters, elevated status. Women who disappointed him faced public humiliation, reduced rations, sometimes physical torture. The cruelty was systematic. Ibrahim would promise marriage to multiple concubines simultaneously, knowing only one could become his official wife, then create elaborate competitions where women were forced to prove themselves through acts that violated their boundaries and dignity. Sexual compliance became the currency through which women purchased basic humanity. As Ibrahim's demands intensified, they crossed lines that even the Ottoman court, accustomed to imperial excess, found disturbing. Palace records mention preferences for certain ages that pushed acceptability, requests for specific physical modifications, requirements for acts that experienced courtesans considered extreme. His appetites seemed to deepen rather than satisfy, as though normal pleasure no longer registered in his damaged nervous system. He needed more control, more extremity, more proof that he could possess completely. The financial strain became impossible to hide. Within 2 years, the imperial treasury showed deficits directly linked to harem expenses. Gold that should have funded military campaigns bought silk sheets from China. Resources meant for infrastructure went to constructing new chambers for Ibrahim's experiments. Military commanders found funding requests denied while the Sultan approved massive expenditures for perfumes and furniture. Border fortifications crumbled while palace workshops worked around the clock on specialized equipment for the harem. The empire's enemies noticed. Ottoman weakness, previously unthinkable, became strategic opportunity. Venetian forces tested Ottoman naval defenses. Persian armies probed eastern borders. Habsburg diplomats reported to Vienna that the Sultan was essentially absent from governance, his attention consumed by sexual obsession. The empire that had terrified Europe for 2 centuries was being hollowed out from within by one man's broken psychology. Then, in 1644, came the whisper that would trigger massacre. A concubine, known only as Sheker, Sugar, approached Ibrahim with devastating news. Someone in the harem had betrayed him. One of his women had supposedly allowed a man into the forbidden quarters. For Ibrahim, this wasn't adultery. It was cosmic violation. The harem represented his absolute dominion, his complete ownership of female sexuality within the empire's heart. The suggestion that another man had penetrated this sacred space triggered something beyond rage, a psychological collapse that made his previous excesses look like restraint. The investigation began immediately. Ibrahim summoned his chief black eunuch, and together they designed interrogation methods that transformed beautiful chambers into torture rooms. Women were dragged from their beds in the middle of the night. The techniques were systematic: isolation, sleep deprivation, starvation, temperature extremes. Some women were forced to watch friends undergo increasingly severe punishment, creating a climate of terror that infected every corner of the harem. But the interrogations produced no confessions. Either the women knew nothing, or their loyalty to each other proved stronger than their fear. The silence didn't calm Ibrahim. It convinced him of a conspiracy. If one woman could betray him, all of them were potential traitors. His solution reveals the depths of sexual psychosis that decades of trauma had created. He would eliminate them all. Every concubine except his highest-ranking wives would die. 300 women. Their deaths would serve as both punishment and purification. The logistics required careful planning. Mass execution in the palace courtyard would trigger revolts and provide ammunition for political enemies. The killings had to appear accidental, or at least deniable. The Bosphorus provided the perfect solution. Its deep waters had swallowed countless Ottoman secrets. Bodies weighted with stones would sink into darkness. The official story would claim a tragic accident during a pleasure cruise. On the appointed night, Ibrahim's guards moved through the harem like bureaucrats of death. They gathered women from chambers, telling them they were being relocated. Some suspected the truth and tried to resist. Armed men subdued them. Others went willingly, believing they were being transferred to provincial palaces or granted freedom. The procession moved through Topkapa's corridors in complete silence. No drums, no prayers. These women simply vanished from the historical record, their names erased as if they'd never existed. At the water's edge, the true horror began. Each woman was bound and weighted with stones, silk robes becoming burial shrouds. The process was methodical and efficient, carried out by men chosen for their ability to follow orders without question. Not soldiers driven by battle fury or zealots driven by ideology, bureaucrats performing administrative murder with Ottoman precision. The psychological impact on the victims was devastating. They understood their fate but remained powerless to prevent it. Some begged, others maintained silence. A few cursed Ibrahim's name as water closed over their heads. The guards worked through the night, disposing of human beings like refuse while the Sultan waited in his chambers for confirmation that his will had been done. Contemporary accounts suggest only one woman survived, supposedly pulled from the water by a passing fisherman after cutting through her bonds. But even this detail remains disputed. If she lived, she never spoke publicly about what she witnessed, perhaps understanding that survival depended on silence. Ibrahim showed no remorse. He expressed satisfaction that his harem had been purified, then within days began planning to replenish his collection of women, sending agents across the empire to acquire fresh concubines. The 300 deaths meant nothing beyond the inconvenience of rebuilding his inventory. But the massacre created problems his damaged mind couldn't comprehend. Rumors spread through Constantinople. Palace servants whispered about missing women. Families demanded answers. Foreign diplomats reported strange stories to their governments. Ibrahim's attempt to hide his crimes only drew more attention, creating scandal that weakened royal authority across the empire. Financially, he'd destroyed millions of gold pieces worth of human property in a single night. Each concubine represented years of investment. The economic impact strained the imperial budget at a time when the empire faced military challenges on multiple fronts. Ibrahim's mental state continued deteriorating. The massacre hadn't satisfied his paranoid fears but intensified them. He began suspecting betrayal everywhere, seeing conspiracies in routine interactions, interpreting administrative delays as sabotage. His ability to govern, already compromised, collapsed entirely. Military commanders reported disturbing changes during strategic meetings. Ibrahim would interrupt discussions of border defenses to describe his latest sexual fantasies in explicit detail. Generals who'd served the empire for decades found themselves subjected to graphic accounts of harem activities when they needed to discuss troop movements. These weren't casual asides. Ibrahim would spend entire war councils detailing physical characteristics he preferred in concubines, completely ignoring reports of Persian advances or Venetian naval movements. Palace records reveal the systematic breakdown of governmental functions. Diplomatic correspondence went unanswered, while Ibrahim obsessed over designing new chambers. Trade agreements expired without renewal because the Sultan was too preoccupied with arranging performances to attend to state business. Military appointments were delayed for months, while Ibrahim interviewed candidates about their personal relationships rather than tactical experience. The empire's enemies exploited this weakness with devastating effectiveness. Venetian spies infiltrated Ottoman ports while the Sultan imported rare aphrodisiacs. Persian forces reclaimed territory while Ibrahim diverted military funds to construct specialized furniture. The breaking point came when Ibrahim announced his intention to marry multiple women simultaneously, violating Islamic law and Ottoman tradition. This wasn't about alliances or heirs. It was about satisfying his compulsive need to possess female sexuality on an unprecedented scale. He planned ceremonies where he'd wed dozens of women in a single day. Religious authorities who'd remained silent during previous excesses finally found their voices. Leading clerics declared Ibrahim's proposed mass marriages would violate sacred law and bring divine punishment. Their opposition triggered violent confrontations as Ibrahim's guards clashed with religious officials who refused to sanction his plans. The economic implications were staggering. Each marriage required massive expenditures for ceremonies, dowries, ongoing support. The imperial treasury couldn't sustain such costs without raising taxes to levels that would trigger revolts. Financial advisors presented calculations showing Ibrahim's plans would bankrupt the empire within months. On August 8, 1648, the Janissaries revolted. They tore Ibrahim's Grand Vizier to pieces in Constantinople's streets. The Sultan, who'd drowned 300 women to satisfy paranoid jealousy, was strangled with a bowstring, the traditional method for executing Ottoman royalty, and his body dumped in an unmarked grave. He was 39 years old. His 8-year reign had transformed the world's mightiest empire into a cautionary tale about absolute power corrupted by unhealed trauma manifesting as sexual obsession. The aftermath revealed the full scope of damage. Ibrahim's son, Mehmed IV, inherited a treasury drained by his father's excesses, an administration hollowed out by neglect, and an empire whose enemies no longer feared it. It would take decades to restore Ottoman credibility, longer to rebuild the financial foundations Ibrahim had destroyed. The human cost was incalculable. Beyond the 300 women murdered in the Bosphorus, countless others had been traumatized, dehumanized, reduced to props in one man's psychological breakdown. Their names, their stories, their humanity, all erased from official records as though they'd never existed. What remains in Ottoman archives are the ledgers, page after page of expenditures for silk and perfume and mechanical devices, construction records for hidden chambers and specialized rooms, financial accounts showing an empire bled dry. These documents tell the story that court chroniclers were too uncomfortable to record, a man so broken by anticipated death that, when he finally received life, he didn't know what to do with it except exercise the control he'd never had over his own existence, projected onto the bodies of women who couldn't escape. The marble corridors of Topkapi Palace still stand, overlooking the Bosphorus where 300 women drowned. Tourists walk through the harem quarters, admiring the architecture, the tilework, the beauty. Most don't know what happened in those rooms. That's perhaps the most disturbing legacy, how easily horror gets smoothed into history, how trauma becomes trivia, how 300 murders become a footnote in the story of an empire. Ibrahim's story isn't really about sexual depravity. It's about what happens when absolute power meets absolute damage, when a broken mind is given complete control over other human beings, when trauma isn't healed but handed a throne. The Ottoman system created Ibrahim by making him anticipate his own execution for 22 years. Then it gave him an empire and wondered why he destroyed it. The truly haunting part isn't that it happened 4 centuries ago. It's that the mechanisms that created Ibrahim, isolation, anticipated violence, absolute power without accountability, still exist in different forms. The specifics change. The psychology doesn't. Power still breaks people, and broken people with power still break others. We remember Ibrahim as mad, perverted, monstrous. We forget that the empire made him exactly what he became, then acted surprised when he did exactly what broken people do when given absolute control. The Bosphorus keeps its secrets. The water that swallowed 300 women flows on, connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, indifferent to the weight of stones and silk it once carried to the depths. History calls Ibrahim mad. Maybe that's easier than calling him what he actually was, the inevitable result of a system that created trauma, weaponized it, then wondered why it destroyed everything it touched.